All right, everybody, welcome back to Tomcat Zone. Left off with the last video with the setup of our Scenario 12 Indian Ocean War. This video here will comprise the first action segment of the game. Just so you guys know, the cool thing about Vassal is up here, usually, where my mouse is kind of moving, if you save files in a log file, it will allow you to play through the log file, and you can see step-by-step actions of the counters as they move. Unfortunately, not all of our game saves were log files, so some of them will just be descriptive explanations of what happened in a action segment turn, and others will actually be able to move through each of the actions that the player did that turn. So we'll see as we go through each one what we have to work with. But anyway, this is the first segment, action segment 1 after game setup, and I explained in the first video my objectives here. So what I'm going to show you first is our task force. So in this scenario, we have a number of carriers for NATO. We have the Clemenceau, we have the Ark Royal, we have the Lincoln, the Ranger, and the Enterprise. So we have 5 carriers, 3 U.S., 1 French, 1 British. We also have the Wisconsin, which is a Iowa-class battleship, which is cool. Now, as we pointed out before, any ship that you see here with a cruise missile icon above it is cruise missile capable. And then when we go over this ship and we look at its logistics, it'll tell us how many cruise missile shots it has. 1. That is the only, between cruise missiles and nuclear weapons, it's the only logistics we're really paying attention to in our game here. We're not going to go with the full logistics option for Fifth Fleet just because it can get tedious in terms of tracking how many ships moved, where they moved, what they used. Anyway, as you can see here, we got amphibious assault vessels here in Task Force 2. The British are escorting those amphibs. The Task Group 4 or Task Force 4, the Lincoln Group, has some Italians with them, but also 2 empty tankers. The empty tankers have to get up to the Persian Gulf. This number right here, 3106, tells us what hex they have to get to. Task Group 7 has the Bayuk. I can't remember the full name of that ship. Anyway, it's a full tanker. The full tankers have objectives too. They have to get out to sea, which is off of the West Indian Ocean. Excuse me, West Indian Ocean zone, or down to Indonesia. Pardon me. The Burmese Endeavour is with the Australians. We have some slow convoy vessels here in Task Group 10. We have some fast convoy vessels in Task Group 9. Those ships have to get to Diego Garcia. Empty tankers in Task Group 12. They are 2 with a, they both have a hex that they have to get to. Hold on one second. Sorry about that, I had to get a drink of water. Then again, we have some full tankers here with Task Group 13. And again with Task Group 18, empty tankers. So all of these ships represent victory points as long as they get to their destinations. And that's my primary objective right now. Again, you'll see some slow convoys here with Task Group 19. Just for those that have never played, task groups and task forces are 2 different organizations of ships. If in Fifth Fleet, if you have 2 to 3 warships, you have a task group. If you get 4, you have a task force, and task forces gain an advantage in defense because of their makeup, where task groups, although they also gain an advantage in defense. Instead of just being single ships out there, they gain a defense, but it's not as good as being in a task force. So anyway, that's you're going to see on the counters. Sometimes are flipped to task group, others are flipped to task force, and that's the reasoning for that. So anyway, those are the objectives of these task groups and task forces, to get these victory point vessels to their objectives, which earn us points. As I scroll over here, we're going to see our carrier air wings, the multiple carrier decks for the Ranger, the Lincoln, the Enterprise, Clemenceau, the Essex, Ark Royal, the Tarawa, and the New Orleans. And then, of course, down this central column here is the cap stations, and they are numeric, and they have a counter on the board which displays their number, and then that number, of course, represents these aircraft in that combat air patrol over a base or over an aircraft carrier or whatever it might be. So that's our setup, and this is a step in the game that I'd already done, which is to combine these counters into task forces. On the initial setup, you don't get to arrange your units in task forces yet. So let's look at the Soviets here and what he's got. All right, Scott's got his, it's a different layout, but it's essentially the same. We've got his combat air patrols across the top, and they're represented again by number, and then the counter on the board represents the aircraft that's here. He's got 5 task groups and task forces. He has 2 aircraft carriers. He's got the Kiev, and he's got the Tbilisi. Tbilisi is a far better aircraft carrier. I think it was never completed. I think it's also a fictional piece that was put in this game to represent a potential that the Soviets might have put together. But the Tbilisi has Su-33s on her, which are far better than the Yak-38 Forgers that are on the Kiev. So he has in here 2 task groups, task forces, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, task forces that are built on the slow convoy vessels. And those convoy vessels are coming out of the Gulf of Aden and out of Ras Karma. And he has to get some of them to Pakistan, no, to Iran, and he's got to get some of them to Ras Karma. Those are targets for me. I have to sink those. Otherwise, he gets, as you can see, this number here above the N is 10 points. He gets 10 points for every ship he lands. So this is potentially 80 points of victory points if he gets them to their objective hexes. So targets for me. If I sink them, they don't give me any benefit. But if I let them get to their locations, they certainly can rack up against my score, which can bring defeat for the NATO forces. So those are targets. We'll look at the Indians real quickly here in their combat display. And you will see that he has 2 carriers here too. So essentially the Soviet Indian forces have 4 carriers on the board against our 5. He's got the Vikrant and he's got the Virat, both of which are British, I think, Invincible class carriers that were purchased from the Brits by the Indians. Except for their combat units here, the Indians are here just to fight. They're not here to offer any kind of auxiliary support vessels to protect. So, excuse me, got this dry throat here, causing coughs. Anyway, so the Indians, although formidable in their 2 carrier forces here, they're not a main target for me. So the next 2 buttons here are unload screens for the NATO forces and unload screens for the Soviet forces. Basically, If we get to certain hexes, those hexes, objective hexes, are worth 1, 1.5, 2, or 3 times their objective point value on the counter. Most of them are 1. Some of them, which are the furthest away or most difficult to get to, increase in value. So those are empty right now because obviously we haven't gotten anybody there yet. Our turn track monitors which turn it is. Every 3 squares represent 1 day, 8 hours per square. So game turn 1 is where we're at right now. And so we got an AM turn, an afternoon turn, and a night turn. There's limitations on bombing and flight capabilities for certain aircraft at night. And then down here we have action segments. And we're in action segment 1 of game turn 1. Each action segment we can activate one of our types of air or types of units: surface, air, or submarines. So I would go, then action segment 2 is the Soviet players. Then we roll for initiative again for 3 and 4. He might get to go again, so he could have 2 and 3, and then I'd go on 4. It all depends. But every 2 action segments, we roll for initiative to see who goes next. And of course, over here are kill piles, which haven't happened yet. Lastly is the negotiations and alliances screen. I added this, but it's a optional rule that you can put into this game. I decided to add it. It's from 6th Fleet. I decided to add it to 5th just because why not? We made some armistice and negotiation tables, and if the war is brought to an end before victory points can be achieved, then hey, essentially the Soviets would win because the Americans have a lot of work to do. Okay, so lastly is our charts and combat summaries and such. Just bringing up the sequence of play to show you where we're at here. So we're in the strategic cycle AM turn. Then each day, or each, as you saw there, game turn 1, 2, 3, that make up a day. Each 8-hour has an activity cycle, but only the AM has a strategic cycle, and only the nighttime turn has the terminal cycles. But each turn has an activity cycle. So we are in the strategic cycle AM and the and the AM activity cycle. So we have already rolled for all these things, random events. So on game turn 1 of the scenario, there are no random events. So that is an easy thing. We didn't have to do anything there, but we did have to roll for weather, and the weather across the Indian Ocean right now is clear, sunny skies, which will be great because it won't impede any of our aircraft or ship movements. Strategic air phase is next. Submarine mode. Submarine mode is an option to put ships into deep mode, submarines into deep mode if they're capable. Makes them move slower, makes them tack a little bit less, with less strength. But it's useful if you're trying to get through a screen of ships and be quiet or whatever. Don't really see a need for it in this first cycle of our game here. In fact, throughout the game as NATO, I didn't do any deep diving of my subs at all. I needed the speed and I needed the firepower. So we get to the strategic air phase. Excuse me. So let's look at that. As I said in the first video that I made, my goal here was to create a major fighter sweep and to put reconnaissance aircraft up. Not necessarily because I want to be able to attack him outright, because my goal at the onset of this game is to be as stealthy as possible and not be detected. And to attack someone obviously causes them to know where you're at. If you fire on someone, they can immediately, or can try to at least, track you down and return fire on you. So the goal here is to punch out any of his reconnaissance aircraft that he might put up over the multiple sea zones. And if you look at our strategic air display here, each of the sea zones that are represented on the main map board are represented here. Aircraft based on their speed, which is the number up here in the upper left, that is their flight range, 28 hexes for a F-15 interceptor. That means he could literally fly 14 hexes out from his base and then have 14 to return. So 14 is his maximum air range. But in strategic maps, you can see up here unit movement allowance. At 28, he could be one zone further than the zone he is in. So he could move, he could patrol in a strategic mission at least one zone outside of the zone he took off from. So all of these aircraft are out of their different bases. I went up in the Persian Gulf. I put a reconnaissance aircraft there because there is a couple subs in the Persian Gulf that I wanted to be able to track down. I'll show you those in a minute. Over the Gulf of Oman, just around my carriers there, my task forces, and all the victory point vessels that are kind of sitting there waiting to start moving. I figured that would be a good place for him to start doing reconnaissance and trying to find those ships and putting a detection marker on them. And by doing so, give him essentially the opportunity to bomb them or hit them with anti-surface missiles. In the strategic detection part of this game, if you detect strategically, you have them for the whole game day, which means the next 3 turns, you know where that ship or that convoy or that task force is, or that sub, for the next 3 turns. So it's critical to give him as many, limit him to as few, I should say, detections, strategic detections as possible. So because I had such high valued targets there in those zones, I put my you'll see here 3 fighter wings above the Gulf of Oman. Over Socotra, I got a fighter wing of tornadoes plus the French Atlantique to do some reconnaissance, try to find some surface or some submarines there. Over the North Arabian Sea, I put a Pakistani F-16s and their J-6s. That left 1 J-6 in their base. I'm going to talk to you here in a second about why this is critical. Plus, of course, their reconnaissance aircraft. Over the South Arabian Sea, these are, as you can see, this little in black here, the name over the aircraft tells you where those aircraft came from. So the Lincoln launched her F-18s, and of course a Orion came out of a different base there. I don't know what base it was. It came out of Masira. And hold on a second. And then down here over the Maldives, we had a similar. We had an F-18s off of the Enterprise, as well as a reconnaissance aircraft from St. Diego Garcia. Chagos Archipelago did the same thing with their other Orion, flew out of Diego to do a patrol there. If you look, all these aircraft are currently sitting in RTB because obviously this is the end of the turn, so once they perform their functions, they all move to the RTB box. In the East Indian Ocean, I had a reconnaissance, and I had 2 reconnaissance aircraft, I should say, as well as an F-18 from the Ranger. Okay, why is all this important? This was important, A, because I wanted to put a bunch of interceptors over most critical ships that I had out there on the board. So if he went to find them, I could either have strong air support to knock his interceptors out, or have massive air to just crush his reconnaissance aircraft that he might fly out and just go bear hunting, basically. But the problem is when you do this, once you put aircraft on a strategic mission, just like I said about the strategic detection, if a aircraft is on strategic mission, it is on that mission for the next 3 turns, meaning that whole day those aircraft are not available. This became a critical issue for me because, as I will show you here, my fighters all took off that morning. They all came home that night, but the problem was he didn't put up any. It was my goal. I didn't know what he was going to do at the first move, so my goal, because no one was even detected yet. No one even knew where anybody was. I figured he's going to go all out to find me. No, he didn't bother. So what's that mean? I have a ton of defense aircraft, fighter interceptors on strategic missions for the next 24 hours. And that means bases are limited to what I didn't put on strategic air. Yes, they're going to be on combat air patrol, but I don't have a lot of my strength is now tied up in this stuff. And because he didn't reciprocate in his strategic missions at the beginning of this game, well, I left my bases really, really wanting or needing, truthfully. So, anyway, we go back to the main map here, and you're going to see that over Socotra, I got a strategic detection on his Task Force 3, which is the slow convoy vessels out of Ras Karma that I've got to kill those guys. Their goal is over here in Pakistan. You can land them at Chah Bahar or Jawani, so it's not that far away. So to find them and kill them as soon as possible, obviously the better. So I detected there with one of my detection aircrafts. In the Maldives, we found one of his Soviet nuclear subs. Down here in the East Indian Ocean, I got a strategic detection on another of his nuclear subs here, the Opakov, and I believe that was all my successes, because even though you have a aircraft, like I had a reconnaissance aircraft over the Persian Gulf here, he has a sub right here. I still have to roll to see if I did, even though I've got a reconnaissance aircraft looking for it, I still have to roll to see if I find it, and I didn't find it. And so that was a wasted aircraft now flying a strategic detection for the next 3 turns. So anyway, but as you can see, he has no detections on any of my ships, which is great. So I'm moving in absolute silence of not, I shouldn't say silence, but certainly he has no track of any of my ships where they're at. So you're going to see here, because there was nothing, I didn't have anything necessarily that I had spotted that I could attack, even though I've got his Task Force 3 here detected. He's got a combat air patrol over Ras Karma, if you remember, and that's number 5 over Ras Karma, which is MiG-23s. They got a fighter strength of 6. The only aircraft I have available to hit a base or hit these ships would have been out of Salala, I should say, and they were Tornadoes. I got one of them on combat air patrol to defend the base. The other one's on strategic mission. So even though I found him, I don't have the aircraft to attack him with. So anyway, so in my first movement, I chose, our first action segment here, I chose surface because I wanted to get the ships moving. I wanted to get my high value ships moving towards their objectives to get those points as quickly as possible. One thing I learned in this game is you got a lot of time. There's a total of 36 turns that you play for this scenario. But that being said, you're going to see that although you have a lot of time, you got to use it wisely. You got to use it real wisely. I start moving my task groups and task forces ASAP. As I moved through this scenario and through the turns of this battle, I come back to the thought that I probably should have consolidated first before I started moving my ships in every direction. Even though they weren't detected, they needed to probably consolidate first. Consolidation would have taken a little bit of time. I have time. It's the beginning of the game. but as you're going to see later on, that time runs out quickly. So anyway, you'll see these little move markers. Task Group 19 headed south towards this area of the Straits of Malacca. Task Group 19 has slow convoys in it. Okay, those slow convoys actually probably, if I brought up the other map, they probably move north. They have to get to Diego, so they didn't head towards the Straits of Malacca. Task Group 16, its make is, okay, just some fast frigates started moving out. Some Indonesian fast frigates. So anyway, Task Group 8 moved, Task Group 9 moved. I know Task Group 9 is fast convoy ships. They're shooting for Diego Garcia as well. So Task Group 19 and 9 are both heading towards Diego. Up here, Task Group 10 is heading towards Diego. They're slow convoys. Task Group